Hey y'all, what's up and welcome back. ENL 51, Rap as Poetry. Today I want to do a deep dive into the Run the Jewels and Zach De La Rocha song, Close Your Eyes and Count to Fuck, um, from I think it's the second album, Run the Jewels 2, that they did. So I'll give a little bit of background on Run the Jewels, who they are, and Zach, and then give a little bit of it's my own personal oral history of this song and when it came out, and then take a look at some of the lyrics and practice analysis and give you kind of one example of how an engaged reader might analyze the poetry of what's going on in this song. Cool. So Run the Jewels is a rap duo made up of Killer Mike and LP. That's spelled EL-P. They are older dudes. I think they're like 40 now or something like that. They got together in their 30s when they were both kind of mid-career already. And they're a weird fit together. I mean, they fit really well together, but it historically, it's a very strange thing that brought them together. So Killer Mike is a kind of political gangster rapper from the South, from Atlanta. He was kind of in the extended circle of Outkast, the Dungeon crew down in Atlanta. And he was an underground rapper who made music that bordered between like political and gangster. And then through a mutual friend, he ended up having LP make the beats for his 2012 album, Rap Music, R-A-P Music. I think that's the album that Reagan is on, which is the song on the B-sides for this week too. So he had this producer, LP, who makes beats. He's a producer, a DJ, in addition to being a rapper. Make some of his own solo music, and they just clicked. They got each other. They worked well together, and so they decided to make an album together where LP rapped as well as made the beats, and that was Run the Jewels. And then they just like realized that they had to keep doing it, and it caught on. There was like a hunger for the kind of music that they were making, a hunger that wasn't being filled in the hip hop community at the time that they were doing it. Maybe it was like 2009 or so was their first album. Is that right? Should have looked it up. Didn't. Doesn't matter. Yeah. So LP. So that's Killer Mike. LP is a New York white dude, rapper and DJ producer. Man, I'm just like putting nouns together. Not even that was a bad sentence. Let me start over. LP, for the first half of his rap career, was the founder of Def Jux, Definitive Jux. It was a record label and crew as part of like the underground rap movement, and in particular, New York independent hip hop. And so he created this record label. He was part of a rap group that put out a very influential underground album on that label, Company Flow. And he rapped and he made beats and he ran this label. And then Def Jux kind of closed down the whole like movement of underground rap, indie rap. We're not going to talk about it a lot in this class. If this was a 15-week class, we would. We just don't have the time, and it's not the most important thing for me to lecture on, but it's something I'm really passionate about. So if you want to talk about it, hit me up, and I just would love to talk about it more. But this movement of like underground rap was really important in the 2000s, really from like 96 or 98 up until I don't know when you want to call its death date, 2009, 2012. I don't know. YouTube changed things a little bit. That's not the only thing that happened, but that's one of the things. So Def Jux, the record label that LP ran, closed down. He closed it down. I don't know the story behind that. And he was at kind of a crossroads in his career, and then he, through a mutual friend, made the beats for Killer Mike's album, Rap Music, and they hit it off, and the rest is the history that I just told. So yeah, the rap duo, the duo of two MCs, is like an important kind of archetype almost in hip hop history. Two MCs working together, and oftentimes the best rap duos have very clearly demarcated personalities or personas or characters or styles. So Public Enemy, Chuck D is a hard-hitting, political-minded, very serious rapper, and Flavor Flav is like admittedly a clown. He's the comic relief, and that's like they used to say it was important to have that balance. Like I think somebody said, I don't know if this is from a poem by Marcus Wicker or if it's from something Chuck D said, or yeah, I think it's a poem by Marcus Wicker. Chuck D would have set cities on fire if it was just him, and they needed the comic relief of Flavor Flav to balance him out. I don't know. I like that idea. And Outkast, we studied in week one. Andre 3000 and Big Boy, very different rappers, very different characters, and something just works about the way they add up, the way they work together. LP and Killer Mike is not as clearly archetypal as, or like they're not playing like very clear different characters in the ways that Chuck D and Flavor Flav do. But I think they each have their own style, and they bring that style very clearly to the mic, to the page, and we see that going on in this song a lot. Cool. Part 2, my personal oral history of the release of Run the Jewels 2 and Close Your Eyes and Count to Fuck. In particular, I was teaching at Indiana University at the time, and I was in my office hours. I held my office hours in a pool hall on campus. I wish I could do that now, but I can't. I was sitting there, and like I saw on some social media, I don't know, that Run the Jewels 2 was coming out. It was kind of like a surprise. We didn't know it was coming out that day or something like that. And the first single was out, or maybe like the single was out before the album. I don't know. And I, was really excited. I liked their first album a lot. And the second album, so the song title comes up, and it's Close Your Eyes and Count to Fuck, Run the Jewels, featuring Zach De La Rocha. And I was like, my mind was like already blown. Zach was the front man for Rage Against the Machine, which was like for me, a really formative musical group. I like learned so much of my politics and my musical taste and my aesthetics and my ideas about life from Rage Against the Machine. Maybe that's an embarrassing thing to admit. I don't care. I liked them a lot, and I was really bummed when they broke up. I was like going to see the Beastie Boys and Rage Against the Machine together in Minneapolis in like 2000, 1999 maybe. Two of my favorite groups. And then Mike D from Beastie Boys broke his back riding his bicycle in New York, so they postponed the tour, and then Rage broke up while the tour was postponed, and they never came through. It's like the huge bummer of my life. Anyway, I see that Zach is on this track, and it's like that's me and a ton of people like me who care about political hip hop and are part of the hip hop community. Super excited to find this out because Zach like released a little bit of music after Rage Against the Machine broke up, but not a lot. He never really reached his potential in the stuff that he put out after that. And it's rumored that he's made a ton of music and just hasn't wanted to release it for one reason or another. So it's really exciting whenever we see that he's on a track. And then so I click play on, I think it's SoundCloud. The song is out, and I click play. And, Zach's voice comes in, he's doing the hook, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast. I'm like, okay. Zach is like really, it's not just a recording, he's really on this track. That's exciting. And the song gets in, and, Killer Mike's verse is awesome, and LP's verse. Awesome in a different way than Mike's. And then they're like trading off and stuff. And it's like, this is an awesome song. But then I start to get worried, because you have a whole verse of Killer Mike and a whole verse of LP, and then a verse of Mike and LP trading off. And that's 3 whole verses. And that's a song. A rap song is often 3 verses. So you start to feel like, oh man, Zach De La Rocha is not actually on the song. He's just doing the hook. And one of the Black Alicious songs that I recommended to you all via email before the quarter started, rest in peace, Gift of Gab, had that very thing. It said Zach De La Rocha was on the song, and then he like said one word on the hook multiple times. So I started to feel really let down. And then that third or fourth, or however you want to call it, verse comes up. There's like a little break in the music where the chorus sort of peters out and the beat drops out. And then Zach comes in with his verse. And on SoundCloud, you can see like people commenting or leaving hearts or whatever on the timestamp of the song. I don't know if that's still true, but it was true back then. And at that moment when Zach's verse came up, it was just like endless hearts and people commenting like, "Oh my God, he's back!" and like everybody super excited. And that was how I felt. I was like in my office hours at a pool hall with my big ass headphones on, like, probably I probably cried a single tear hearing Zach's verse. And like he's really here and doing it. So that's exciting. Killer Mike, LP, and Zach De La Rocha coming together to make a revolutionary song. And the video is worth watching too. It's another, there's violence and a dude fighting a police officer. So it's intense, but it's interesting that they made it. Cool. So that was part 2, my personal oral history of Close Your Eyes and Catch. Part 3, let's do a deep dive of some analysis of what is going on in this song poetically, what we're noticing about some of the stylistic tendencies of these rappers, how they work together and individually. And in the context of this week, we're studying the Black radical tradition. Cool. So I haven't practiced this or made any notes to myself. So I'm just going to kind of scan through the lyrics and talk my way through it a little bit. And this is the kind of thing I would do if I was writing a weekly forum post. I would look through the lyrics, kind of make some notes to myself or talk to myself a little bit and pick out a few of the most interesting points that I came up with and maybe like expand on them a little bit and maybe try to make some connections or something. Cool. So it starts off Killer Mike in clearly setting a revolutionary tone, fashion slave, protesting to get in a fucking lookbook. Everything I scribble is like the anarchist cookbook. So already he's like letting us know that he's on his revolutionary style, talking about the anarchist cookbook. Everything I scribbles like the anarchist cookbook. If you don't know about that, it was like you could like find it on the internet when you were a 15-year-old Rage Against the Machine fan, for example, and you got nervous that the FBI would start following you if they saw you downloading the anarchist cookbook. But it had like recipes for homemade bombs, descriptions of how to hack into payphones. It was called phone freaking. I don't know if you even know what payphones are. So there's all this like anti-establishment stuff in the anarchist cookbook. For Killer Mike to say everything I scribble is like the anarchist cookbook is to say that rap is inherently revolutionary, inherently a way of using whatever power you can muster to fight against the establishment of white supremacist, capitalist, government, police, state forces. So that's a radical thing to do. And he goes on with a clear celebration of blackness in his kind of conflating his revolutionary physical style with blackness and also with being a criminal, a crook. Very quickly transitions into an extended scene of, again, a prison break. This calls to mind Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos by Public Enemy. He's not necessarily clearly referring to that song, and yet we see a common theme emerging that not only is police violence and police brutality a fact of Black life and a flashpoint for resistance and for protest, but imprisonment, the carceral state, and the ways that the logics of prison work is another kind of flashpoint for the violence that is done against Black people and creates opportunities for resistance. And so I highly encourage you all to look up and learn a little bit about abolitionism, prison abolitionism in particular. Yeah, so there's a ton of great things going on in the style of Killer Mike's verse. I'm impressed by his extended rhyme scheme. He uses some internal rhymes. He's got a clear flow that moves the verse forward, and it gives us this kind of extended visual, imagistic scene of what happens in the prison. Then LP comes in. This is part of the stylistic difference between Killer Mike and LP. It's not that LP isn't a political dude and isn't a political rapper, but he's not as focused of a political rapper as Killer Mike is necessarily. He kind of goes off on some tangents. He says some weirder, more science fiction-y type stuff. He boasts a little bit more, and he has this really unfortunate tendency to just devolve into rhyming about his penis. And that's just LP. Uh, yeah, I don't know what to say about it. And yet, I really value some of the rhyme schemes, and again, the internal rhymes that LP is working with in this his first verse here. Uh, he continues the critique of the criminal justice system that Killer Mike laid out in the first verse. This whole court is unimportant. You fuckers are walking corpses. And I love this. You fuckers are walking corpses. I'm a flip wig synonym. There's some internal rhyme there. It's kind of slant rhyme. Flip wig synonym. Lots of sounds. Living within distortion. I'll bite into a cyanide molar before you whores win. Just the kind of rolling chain rhymes of the distortion, molar, whores win, as multi-syllable rhymes and repetitions throughout and inside of the lines that creates a pretty enjoyable and pleasant flow. Cool. The one thing I want to say about LP's rhyming about his dick in this verse is that it does end up leading into an interesting and important political point that connects to the stuff that we're talking about this week and in this class. At the end of his, I didn't number these verses, so I don't know. The end of his second verse, he says, not shitting you, little buddy. This fucking island's a prison. The only solace I have is the act of conjugal visiting. So what he's saying here is New York, the island that he lives on, is itself a prison. And his whole verse is kind of talked about the dissonant nature of the city. He's talking a little bit about what city life and urban life, especially working class urban life, does to the psychology of a person, how it kind of distorts you. And he says, this whole fucking island, this whole fucking city is a prison. It operates by the same structures and logics that the prison system does, and is a point that a lot of the people who study the carceral state say, is that the whole structure of capitalism in the city is a kind of imprisonment, a kind of policing and a kind of imprisonment. So LP says that, and he says the only way that I have of getting some peace in this life is conjugal visiting, is having romantic or amorous experiences. So there's an element of sex positivity there that we can get behind. And the way that Killer Mike then takes that up. So in the first verse, we had Killer Mike critique, he staged a prison riot, and then LP rolled into his verse by talking about this whole court is unimportant. So there was like a kind of link and progressive story arc sort of there, and we get that again. So LP says the conjugal visiting thing, and then Killer Mike, this is, I think, the best part of this song, Killer Mike's final little chunk before Zach's verse. He talks about solitary confinement, preventing conjugal visits, and what that does to a person. He gives us a whole psychological sketch here. So I want to pause for a moment, my analysis of Killer Mike, and call us back to Melly Mel's song, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's The Message. In that fifth verse of Melly Mel's song, it's fascinating. I wish I had talked about this more in the other video. Melly Mel is like, he gives us scene after scene of what it's like living in the city for Black and brown working class folks especially. And then the fifth verse, he tells like the whole life story of a person. And it starts out with like promise and potential and peace. I don't have the lyrics in front of me and I'm struggling to call to mind what he says, but he like starts out with an infant blind to the ways of mankind, right? And then he shows how social conditioning and the pressures of poverty lead this perfect potential of humanity into becoming a stick-up kid who gets sent to prison for 8 years and gets totally abused and mistreated in prison and dies. and it's like a sad. I like, I get a little weepy eyed at that fifth verse of Melly Mouse. So he presents like a whole psychology and sociology of how crime comes to be, of how a person with limitless potential ends up being shaped by their social environment. And Killer Mike, Melly Mel's story is super tragic and sad and shows like the violence of oppression and poverty. Killer Mike's verse here does, in some ways, almost the opposite. It still presents a full psychology and sociological sketch of what happens to a person in prison or what happens to a person living in the poverty, impoverished police state that is the American anti-Black city. But he, instead of saying that this is a tragedy that's going to kill us, he says this leads to a visionary, a revolutionary who's going to fight back against the system. Conditions create a villain. The villain is given vision. The vision becomes a vow to seek vengeance on all the vicious liars and politicians. So first, stylistically, notice the intense alliteration, the repetition of the V sounds. Almost calls to mind V for vendetta a little bit, but that shows like extreme lyrical skill. The way he's like repeating these sounds creates a lot of smooth flow. And I think that smoothness of the flow kind of depicts or manifests in a way the smooth transition that this person makes from being a villain to being a revolutionary visionary. It's like a smooth movement into revolution. Second of all, I really like the rhythm that he builds here. The villain is given vision. The vision becomes a vow to seek vengeance on all the vicious. And then that line break is really hard. And yet the sentence moves on without, there wouldn't be punctuation there. We in poetry would call this enjambment. I would call it hard or heavy enjambment. Seek vengeance on all the vicious, liars and politicians, profiteers of the prisons. So he continues that same multi-syllable rhyme scheme, but there's like a hard break there. And it's just like rhythmically, it's an interesting thing that catches your attention. It shows the importance of what he's saying, and it creates a clear separation between this visionary villain and the liars, politicians, profiteers of the prisons, forehead engravers, and slavers of men and women. Clear divide between these two. Cool. So then we get into Zach's verse, and I'll just say a little bit about Zach's verse because this lecture is getting longer than I meant for it to. Other than to just say it's wonderful to have Zach spitting a verse. This was 10 years ago now, I guess. Jesus. One thing that is really interesting about Zach's verse, we're studying the Black radical tradition this week. I've talked about in the last video how referring back to the legacy of previous Black revolutionaries is an important aspect of the Black radical tradition. And we see that going on in Zach's verse. I also wanted to note that both LP and Zach are non-Black people, and yet they are students too of the Black radical tradition, and they can, in their own humble ways, contribute to that tradition by the various techniques that they're using in these poems and the ways that they are amplifying the politics of Black revolutionary history. So Zach, in this verse, one of the things he does that's congruent with the Black radical tradition stylistically is he uses a lot of allusions, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N-S. Might have skipped a letter there. A-L-L, allusions. In other words, a lot of references to previous figures in Black revolutionary art and thought. First, he refers to De La Soul in his, even though it's part of his name, it's De La on the cut. That's Zach De La Rocha, but he's also comparing himself kind of inherently to De La Soul. We will study some of their work later in the quarter. He says, I'm miles ahead of you. You can sip my bitch's brew. That's not just him talking shit. It is him talking shit, but he's referring to Miles Davis, super important visionary jazz musician. Miles Ahead was one of his albums. Bitches Brew was another one of his albums. And Miles Davis, he's known for having like a really kind of bombastic image. He presents himself in as like a really free person who is, through the nature of his jazz music and his creativity, is able to do whatever the fuck he wants, and nobody can step to him about it. Bitches Brew. I'm not a jazz scholar. I don't know a lot about jazz, but I understand that it was an album that like really changed the game a little bit. It changed what jazz music could do. It also changed what Miles Davis was doing. It's a stark contrast from the kind of music he was making before that, I think. Um, Anyway, referring to De La Soul and Miles Davis in the first two lines of your verse, clearly Zach is situating himself in this tradition of the Black radical tradition and of musicians who use their art to break boundaries socially. And not only like just politically. De La Soul and Miles Davis, they're kind of like also like philosophically and spiritually, they're breaking boundaries in their work. And then later on in the verse, we've got a reference to Rakim, the God MC, Rakim, Rib like Rakim Allah. Feds is checking my melody, check my melody. It's a Rakim song. And so he's not only just name dropping Rakim, but he's saying here, it's kind of drawing a parallel between, or saying that rap is inherently like an anti-state activity, that to be like Rakim is to invoke the policing of the feds. The feds will check your melody, will surveil you, keep you under surveillance for being a revolutionary rapper. So he's saying that rap is revolutionary, right? And there's also references to Philip K. Dick in this, and Blade Runner, and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which are not part of the Black radical tradition. And it's been a long time since I've seen Blade Runner or read. I haven't read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Philip K. Dick, cool novelist. But anyway, that stuff is going on in this too. So if there's some stuff you're confused about, look that stuff up. And then finally, I just want to make the point that in the last 4 lines of Zach's verse, what he's doing here to connect very separate political social issues, I think is part of what the Black radical tradition does so well in connecting class, colonialism, and race. So he says, with reason to dump on you global grand dragons. The grand dragon is like a leader in the KKK. And so to say that there are global grand dragons is to say that the powerful and oppressive leaders of like capitalist globalization are white supremacists, are grand dragons, that there's some parallel between what the KKK does here and what these figures of global capitalism do across the globe. And then he makes it a little bit more clear in the next line, talking about Afghani toe tagging. So he's saying like the war in Afghanistan, a war fought for oil, and the murder of these poor brown people in Afghanistan is part of this structure, is part of what this global KKK does. So there's a link between white supremacy in the United States and militarism and neo-colonialism, you might want to call it, in like the war in Afghanistan, for example. And then that last line, the only thing that closed quicker than our caskets be the factory. And there's two ways of reading this line, and I'm not sure which one I think he means. I'm not sure which one he means. But on the factory closing could either mean like, the economy is grinding to a halt and nobody can find jobs, the factories are closing down. It could be that kind of thing, and speaking to the plight, the struggle of working class people to find work. Could also be that the workers are shutting down the factories, that we're going to go on strike, which would mean like the only thing dying faster than us, the working class and the revolutionaries, is going to be the factories. Before you kill us, we're going to shut down the stuff that keeps the rich rich and keeps the poor poor. We're going to go on strike. I like that reading more, but I don't know if that's what he means. He might also just mean life sucks for the working class. We're going to die, and the only thing that happens before that is we're going to be out of a job. Could mean that too, but I don't know. Cool. That got a little bit more rambly than I thought, and not everything I said made perfect sense, I'm sure, but I just wanted to give you a kind of example of how one approaches rap lyrics analytically, tries to think a little bit about the stylistic devices the rappers are using, and the philosophies, the political ideas, the worldviews that they're presenting in their work. We could also talk about how Killer Mike's verse is a little bit more narrative. He tells a little bit more of a story, and LP and Zach both kind of are a little bit more lyrical. They don't tell a narrative as much. They're kind of just piecing together different references in order to create a sort of atmosphere of revolutionariness. I don't know. I like this song. I hope y'all like it. I'm excited to see what you all come up with for your weekly forum posts. As always, if you have any questions, if you want to chat about this, hit me up, shoot me an email. I can either respond over email or we can set up a time to chat over Zoom. Thanks, y'all, and you will see me soon.